The next step is filling in our outlines with watercolor. At this point, if you haven't done so yet, make sure that you do erase your grid lines. You don't need these anymore. Mine are added with Sharpie, so I'm going to be leaving, obviously, these grid lines here. But we're gonna fill in our drawings with watercolor, still looking at our reference picture. So our reference picture, like we talked about, is pasteurized, which means it's broken up into the areas of value. This is pasteurized to one of the lowest settings where you can only see areas of white, gray, and black. For your final portrait, you'll have the choice and the option to pasteurize it even further. So if you do this, it makes it a little bit more complex. However, it will add more detail into your portrait. So something to think about for when you get to your final project. If you do choose this, it will add more levels of gray. So it's not just black, white, and gray, but it would be black, dark gray, gray, light gray, and white. But for now, again, we're just working with black, gray, and white tones. For this section, we're going to be working with complementary colors. So choose which two colors you would like to work with. Think about which of those two colors is naturally a darker color. So if I'm working with red and green, for example, green is a darker color since red is the warmer tone. So green I would maybe want to start with in the shadow areas. Yellow and purple, for example, purple is more of the darker color naturally. So I'm going to be working with purple for the shadow tones and then yellow for highlights. If you switch and use yellow for the shadows, that can work as well. Just make sure that you do add enough black and enough water to get your tint and shade of the colors. So for this example, I'm gonna just be working with orange and blue. And since blue is a darker color naturally, orange is more that warmer tone, I'm gonna be working with blue for all of my shadow areas. So I'm gonna start with the shadow areas first, and it's up to you which section or which color and value you want to work with. But I'm going to use the black area first. So I'm going to take my blue and mix it with black to get my color to work with. So the lid here is just the mixing tray for my palette. So I'm going to be grabbing some black and making sure I have plenty of water, and then grabbing some blue to mix with it. So I'm making sure that it's a nice and dark value so that it's going to really fill in the darkest areas so I have plenty of contrast. You'll notice right here that it is a nice dark desaturated blue. However, if you would like it to be darker, I would recommend working in layers. So once this is dry, I can go back over it, add a little bit more of my dark blue color to make it even darker. One of the steps that we're going to be doing later is adding charcoal to bring our details back. And by adding charcoal, this can help to emphasize and really darken some of the darker areas. So if you choose to just go over it once, that is completely fine as well. So what I'm doing now is just looking at all of the areas that are black on my reference picture and getting those filled in. So there's this largest chunk on the right here that I'm filling in. And this whole time too, I am grabbing a little bit of water so that the consistency of my paint is nice and smooth as I'm applying it. So I'm grabbing a little bit more paint, and in some of these smaller sections, I would recommend using a smaller brush and definitely use less water in these areas. The less water that you use, the easier it is to keep your color contained to just one section. So I'm filling in the area that's black above the eyelid here, the little areas on the eyebrow that are black, the pupil in the middle of the eye, the line where the eyelashes are, which extends down, and then the corner of the eye here. And then there's just a little bit going around the outside of the eye. So all of these areas are my black shadow tones. Now at this point, I would let this dry and decide if I want to go over it with a little bit more. I can even try to add more black into my mix to darken it a little bit, just to help really bring out the contrast. So having contrast means areas that are really dark and areas that are really light, and that's going to help your overall image really pop the more contrast that you have in it. But like I said, if you want to just use the charcoal to go back over this later, that will help to really emphasize those darker shadow tones. So I'm going to stop here and move on to my next color. So I used blue in the shadow areas. It's up to you at this point if you want to continue working with the same color or if you want to switch to your secondary color. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my orange, but if you chose to still just stick with blue and then just use orange for the highlight sections, then I would just use blue without mixing any black into it. But I'm going to use orange just to really see the obvious difference between those areas where it's blue and the areas where it's gray. So the gray tone is my hue. So this is just the natural color where I don't have black mixed with it and I don't have too much water added so it doesn't become too light of a color or value. So right now my orange is a little bit muddy here, so I'm going to make sure to clear this off. That happens when your colors get mixed a little bit. So I'm making sure that my orange is cleared off, just rinsing it with water so that I have that straight, nice orange hue to work with. So I'm not going to really mix anything. I'll just be working right out of my palette for this and filling in all areas that are gray. So here is my orange value, getting everything filled in. And again, play around with different paint brushes to see what's going to work the best for you. My brush right now is a little bit big for some of these smaller detailed areas, so definitely good to be switching to smaller brushes when you need to. And then larger brushes obviously will fill in those larger sections quicker, such as the outside area where we worked with that dark blue color. So I'm going through, filling in my orange, taking my time to make sure that I'm really just sticking to the edges of where my outline are at, trying not to get the color outside of the outline. Watercolor is very easy to blend with what's near it. So if this blue isn't completely dry, my orange is going to mix with my blue. And since they're complementary colors or across from each other on the color wheel, they're not really going to create a nice color when they do blend together. So make sure that all of the blue that you worked with first, or whatever color you chose to use first, is completely dry before you begin to add the next color. That way you're not creating kind of a muddy color in between. All right, so I have most of my gray areas filled in. There's a little in the eye here that I need to add. And then the last section that we have is the area of highlight, or that white section. We do want to leave this mostly white, so we don't want it to be too dark of a value where you can't see that contrast between light and dark. But I'm still going to add just a touch of color into it. So at this point, I could either switch back to my blue and just use a really, really watered down blue, or I could continue with my orange and use a watered down orange to create a light value. So I'm just going to continue with my orange, but again, totally up to you what you want to use. And I'm going to bring this back into my paint palette. So I'm going to add a little bit of orange here. And remember, we're working with a tint. So a tint is where you're adding with watercolor extra water to really lighten the color that you're working with. So here's my orange, just adding plenty of water to it so that it's nice and watered down. And then I'm going to take this color and start to add it into my lighter areas, or the white sections. A few things to think about. You don't have to fill in your entire white area. Maybe you just want to use a little bit of the orange around the outside, almost creating kind of a vignette here. Or if you want to fill everything in, you can fill everything in. But you'll notice that my orange is barely visible. It's mostly a really light value so that I'm not taking away from the contrast, and you can still really see clear areas of highlight, medium tone, and shadow. When you're finished, let it dry, and then move on to the next step of adding black and white charcoal to refine your image.